All right, class. I hope you guys are enjoying your wonderful snow day. Hopefully, no more than this one, but we'll see. So I hope you're enjoying it. And unfortunately, hopefully, you can do about 15 minutes of this ed puzzle and answer a few questions because we do need to get through stuff so we can make sure we're staying on pace for the midterm next week. So, section five is going to deal with Alexander the Great and what we're going to call the Hellenistic age, or the age where the West truly becomes influenced by Greek culture. So this flip, though, is basically just going to deal with the life of Alexander the Great. I've also included a more in-depth timeline. You don't need to really know anything specific off of that, but it really gives you a more in-depth look at his conquests and his life. So you can read through that, attach that on Classroom if you do want to see that. But it's certainly not necessary. So basically, we're coming back to ancient Greece where we left off with the small Greek city states on the Balkan Peninsula squabbling, fighting. You had the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. Then Thebes took over for a while as a dominant city state. Then Corinth, and they just can't get along. And the whole time this is going on, you're going to have a huge superpower building to the north, a Greek-speaking people in a place called Macedon. And under their king, whose name is Philip II, they're going to build a huge army. And Philip is one by one going to come down and conquer all of those squabbling Greek city states and make Macedon the dominant power in the Greek speaking world. And in doing so, he's going to set the stage for his son, Alexander, to become the greatest conqueror perhaps the world has ever seen, and also bring about what we're going to call Hellenization, or the making Greek of Western civilization. In 338 BC, that's BC, not AD, Philip II of Macedon is going to defeat the combined armies of Athens and Thebes at the Battle of Chaeronea. This is going to mark the end of the Greek city state period, and the city states will now be subjugated to the rule of Macedon. Okay, so the city states of Greece are now under Macedonian control. Unfortunately, though, the Greeks aren't going to take this lying down, and at a wedding, Philip II is actually going to be assassinated by pro-Greek or pro-Greek city-state um, conspirators. Unfortunately, it's not going to really work out for the Greek city-states because even after Philip II is assassinated or murdered, he is replaced by his son, Alexander. And Alexander is one of many sons of many wives of Philip II. But Alexander's mom, Olympias, is able to kind of outmaneuver all of these other sons created by Philip II to get him acclaimed the next leader of Macedon. And he's only 20 years old when this happens. So in 336 BC, Philip is assassinated. And as I said, his son Alexander is going to take control of his small empire at the age of 20. Now, by this point, Alexander's had a lot of military success. He actually controlled one of the wings of his father's army in many of these battles. He's pretty battle hardened, and he's also really smart. He was privately tutored by Aristotle, our old friend from the philosophy section in this chapter. So he's smart, he's militarily advanced, and again, he's young. And we're going to see over the next 12 years, he's going to pretty much conquer the entire Western world that we've been looking at the ancient Middle East, Egypt, Greece, and even parts of what we would look at as the Indus River Valley. We'll leave China and more other parts of Western Europe out of this, but really, he will conquer most of the places we've talked about this year, which is pretty amazing to think he was only on the planet for 32 years and did so much. So Alexander takes over and quickly puts down any rebellions in Greece, pretty violently, actually. He might be called the Great, but he's certainly not nice. And he's actually going to really want to outdo his father. He definitely kind of lived in his father's shadow, Philip II, and he wanted to outdo him. And he's going to do this by setting his sights across the Aegean to the weakening Persian Empire, our old friends, the Persians. And he's going to say, I'm going to conquer those people and fulfill kind of what had been his father's dream and show that he was even better than his father. Under the rule of its emperor Darius III, Persia's really become corrupt and weak, and Darius doesn't act like, let's say, Darius the First or even Cyrus the Great. He's not going around his empire making sure everybody's together. He's not running things in an efficient manner. He's kind of just sitting in his palace, kind of living off the wealth of the emperors. And the empire and all its multinational people are really starting to fracture, and they're ripe to be picked off by the armies of Alexander the Great. And so that's what we're going to talk about next. So Alexander builds a giant army, is going to cross the Aegean, and he's going to one by one defeat Darius in numerous battles, and he's going to conquer Persia and beyond. So in 334 BC, Alexander leads his army across the Aegean into Asia Minor. He's going to fight his first battle uh, at the Granicus River, and he's going to defeat the forces of Darius there. Alexander the Great, in his whole life, will never lose a battle. He's a military genius. He puts himself in the thick of the fighting. His men adore him. They'll follow him to the ends of the earth, as we'll see. After that, he moves down the coast of the ancient Middle East, conquering Persian strongholds. He then goes and conquers Egypt. All the while, every battle he fights against Darius, he defeats him. He'll defeat him at the Battle of Issus, and then eventually in the ancient Middle East, in the Tigris and Euphrates area, he'll defeat Darius in the final battle at Granicus. And from there, he'll have basically Persia at his fingertips. Um, so again, he wins major victories at Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela, and I'm going to show you a map in a second that kind of shows you where these big battles are. By 331, which is pretty impressive, he's taken all of the Persian Empire, including the great city of Babylon that we talked about. That kind of becomes his home base, and he actually burns down the Persian capital of Persepolis just to kind of end Persia as we know it. Darius III, coincidentally, will run away after Gaugamela, and he'll be actually murdered by his own bodyguards. Kind of an inglorious end to the great Persian dynasty. Um, Alexander at that point doesn't stop just with being happy to have conquered Persia. In 326, he's actually going to set his sights over the Hindu Kush Mountains and want to invade into what would be modern day Afghanistan and modern day India and Pakistan. And so he's actually going to invade over the Hindu Kush Mountains into what we would look at as where we talked about the Indus River Valley area, which is modern day Pakistan. And he's going to find it really hard, though. Even though he never loses a battle, he's going to find it hard to try to have all of these different Indian kingdoms he conquers under his control. Because once he leaves one, they rise up again. He's got to go back. It's like playing whack-a-mole. And his army's going to start to grumble. They're going to lose a lot of men in battles in India. Alexander the Great will actually also lose his beloved horse Bucephalus, who you look at if you look at the timeline. And poor Bucephalus dies in one of these battles in India, and Alexander actually names a city after him. One of the few cities that Alexander founds that is not named after himself because he is kind of an egomaniac. But again, he's really frustrated by India because every time he conquers one little kingdom, another one rises up, and then he leaves there, and that kingdom rises up. And eventually, he decides he wants to cross the Himalayas into China, but by that point, his troops are like, we're not going. We're tired. We've been fighting for 8 years. We love you. We'll follow you as far as we can, but we've gone as far as we can. And so he and his troops kind of come to an agreement that they're going to go back to Babylon. Some of his men can return back to Macedon to see their wives and children. I mean, it's been 8 years of constant warfare, and then they'll come back after they get rested, and they will eventually go back towards the east. And he wants to conquer all the way to the ends of the earth. He's that driven to conquer the whole world. So he'll lead his army back to Babylon. He'll have some tough times crossing the Gedrosian Desert. I'll show you on a map. But they will make it back to Babylon. Unfortunately, while back in Babylon, regrouping, he actually catches a fever allegedly and dies. Some people think he might have contracted malaria in India. Others say maybe he was poisoned by his generals. So he gets really sick at the age of 32, an extremely young age. And when he's on his deathbed, even though he has a son, he's asked, who do you want to rule? And he says to his generals, I want my empire to go to the strongest, kind of inviting uh, a power struggle, a war between all of his generals over who's going to take this great empire he's conquered. In the end, though, his three major generals decide not to fight one another. They decide to divide his empire. So his empire becomes split by his three greatest generals. One of his friends in general named Ptolemy will take Egypt. One of his generals named Cassander will take Greece and Macedon. And one of his generals named Seleucus will take Persia and that whole area. Cassander, by the way, will actually kill all the offspring of Alexander and his mother to make sure he's not challenged as king of Greece and Macedon. So Alexander's line of descendants will pretty much end after his death as well. And then what that's going to bring about, though, is the fact that pretty much the entirety of the eastern part of the Mediterranean is going to be ruled by these Greek generals and their offspring. And it's going to have changing borders and changing leaders, but overall, the eastern part of the Mediterranean is be dominated by Greeks, and that's going to lead to a process we call Hellenization, which is probably the true great legacy of Alexander. But again, if you think about it, by the time he's 32, before he dies, why do we call him the Great? Kind of because of his conquest, but also his legacy of making the West have the foundation of Greek culture. And that's what I'll talk about hopefully in class. But if not, I'll have to make another flip if you get another snow day. Just to give you an idea here, what I'm talking about with these conquests, this is the capital of Macedon in Pella. So Alexander is going to come over here and he's going to fight his first battle over here on the Granicus River, where he's going to defeat Darius the first time. I'm going to move up this way, and then he's going to fight at Issus. He's going to defeat him here. Another great story about Alexander is at Issus, there's a big temple, and in the temple is a giant knot, like a rope that has a huge knot in it called the Gordian knot. And the story said that whoever untied the knot would be king of Asia. So Alexander walks into the temple and he goes, "Oh, I gotta untie the knot to be king of Asia." And they're like, "Yeah, nobody's ever been able to do it." He takes his sword and he chops the knot. And he says, "Well, I did it. I guess I'm the king of Asia." Which gives you an idea of like the kind of personality he has. From Issus, he rolls down here. He lays siege to the city of Tyre, takes that over, comes down, takes over all of Egypt. One of his most famous cities he's going to found, we're going to talk about a little later, is Alexandria right here. But he makes many cities that he calls Alexandria, Alexandropolis. He's a bit of an egomaniac, but wouldn't you be too? From there, he comes up this way, and then he fights the final great battle over here, okay, on the banks of the Tigris River at Gaugamela. He moves down, he takes over Babylon, Susa, and here's the Persian capital. He burns Sepolis down, comes up here, takes over all this area, Bactria, we call it. It's modern day Afghanistan. Over in here, parts of Iran is all in here. He comes down here, goes into India, and then eventually crosses back. And it's here in the Gadrosian Desert. He loses a lot of men, actually. It's kind of a bad move on his part to try to get back to Babylon. So that is that. So basically, that's the life of Alexander. That's where we'll leave this for now. Hopefully, I'll see you in class to teach you the rest of this. But if we do get a second snow day, I'll give you a flip, another flip on basically everything else, which would be Hellenization, Greek culture, etc.